So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining. So today we have a great opportunity to hear directly from one of our winners from the first GDC Innovation Challenge, Bidhaa Sasa. And we look forward to having a quite an interactive session throughout the full hour. So if I can start with an introduction of myself. My name is Yvonne from Bobbing, who is one of the founding members of the GDC. And I have been supporting the GDC Innovation Challenge awardees to implement the ideas throughout the pilot period. And together with me today, I have my colleagues from the GDC, Charlotte and Juliet. If you can introduce yourself in less than a minute, that would be great.
Hi everyone, I'm Charlotte Taylor. You've probably seen me if you've attended any of our recent webinars. So I lead our communications and impact work at the GDC. Great to see you here today.
And hello, I'm Juliet. I also work for the GDC as Communications and Project Officer. So it's lovely for you to all join us today.
Great. So if we can move on and just set the scene on what to expect in the call today. So we would have an introductory session just to understand and learn from Bidhaa Sasa and see what they were able to do throughout their pilot and the lesson learned. So there will be a lot of time for us to also answer your questions based on the information that will be shared, and that will be in the second half of the webinar. But as we go along to the presentation, we would appreciate if you would drop your questions in the chat, which is actually at the bottom of your screen. And during the Q&A session, which we will have later in the session, it will be great if you can unmute yourself and just raise your questions directly. So before we start, we have a few housekeeping rules. One of them is, if you can do it now, is at least to add the name of your organization next to your name on Zoom. So just we can get a sense of who already is in the room. Secondly, kindly remain unmuted, at least if you're not speaking, so as to minimize any background noise and any disruptions that might come up. And also just to let you know that we are recording the sessions also for those who were not able to join and would like to learn from this. So we will share the recording and the link to the tool with participants afterwards. So just a short introduction of the Innovation Challenge before we begin. So the GDC Innovation Challenge is a unique challenge that crowdsources ideas from GDC members and other organizations that support last mile distribution. So with the support of our members, the GDC members, we select and pilot the ideas, such as the one that you'll be talking about today, the Bidhaa Sasa, and support other last mile distributors to learn from these ideas through webinars such as this, in order to replicate in their own geographies. So a short introduction of Bidhaa Sasa and their idea that they did in the first Innovation Challenge, which was coming up with a bespoke, which was to come up with a bespoke toolkit, which they call the LEAP. And LEAP stands for Leadership, Enterprise, Attraction, and Provision, which are the 4 principles which make up the core elements of any scaling plan when LMDs plan to scale into new regions. And by doing this, you can use lean principles, especially when you are scaling. So we expect that from this particular webinar that you learn from Bidhaa Sasa have shown that this particular tool can help last mile distributors to improve how they assess, how they plan, and implement their scaling strategies. We hope that this particular tool will help you and the wider sector to move away from traditional linear scaling, the traditional scaling strategies that have been used in the past, and try to adopt lean scaling principles instead. So now it's a good time to hear from Rocio, and Rocio is one of the co-founders and director of Bidhaa Sasa. And the first question I'd have for you, Rocio, is, what led you to develop this scaling tool? And what was missing that meant you needed to develop this tool from the very beginning?
Yeah, Thanks, Yvonne. Hi, my name is Rocío, and I'm one of the co-founders of Bidhaa Sasa, which is a last mile distribution company based in Kenya and also in Uganda. And that's what I'm going to share with you, this journey of going from one country to the other one. So the story, so everything started maybe a couple of years ago when we, after being operating in Kenya around 5 years, we started to think about where do we go next? We believed that we understood what we were doing in Kenya, and we were thinking of going to our next geography. And it's not as easy as adding stuff in the same country, because you are, even though if the countries are very similar and they are next to each other, everything can be very different, or perhaps not. But really, you don't really know until you do it. So we looked around, what are the different tools that other people have used? This is nothing new. People are expanding and contracting all the time. Therefore, we naively thought there will be something out there that you could use as a guide of how you expand internationally. But beyond the usual do market research, study, pay somebody or do it yourself, or a checklist of are you ready to scale? Do you have the resources, i.e. the money to go to another country? We couldn't really find any practical tool or any practical advice of how do you physically go to another country. And coincidentally, at that time, the GDC was launching the first Innovation Challenge program. We submitted this idea of creating a tool to expand geographically and to scale up. With a little bit of money, we and obviously there was lots of back and forth with the GDC members and BOP Inc. On the what do we want to do and what the philosophy is behind all this idea of creating this tool that is designed specifically for last mile distribution companies. And I'll share that with you now. What I want to say is that this is about expansion geographically. You would start with a business model that you think is successful in your existing model, in your existing market, and then you want to go to another one. This, for example, would not cover another way of scaling, which is merging or acquiring another company, because that's a completely different thing that will probably require other techniques and other ways of operating, which I don't know anything about it. So what I'm sharing here is the classic organic growth, you could call it, when you go from market A to market B, and what you really, really want to do is adapt the existing business model to the new context. That is all about adaptation. And the philosophy that we use here is about, we are borrowing the lean startup principles of experimentation and iterations, which I'll explain later. Maybe what I'll do before I go into the details, what we wanted is something that was very practical. You know, this is your template. This is the 5 things you need to do before you go to the next country, and this is how you learn as you go along. And obviously, something that doesn't break the bank, because often these theoretical market studies, they are expensive if you have to pay a third party, and they are really far away from the reality. If, you know, in our case, we operate in rural areas, and there's no market data for rural areas in any of the countries that we are familiar with. So you will be kidding yourself that you will get some value from very generic market research.
Thank you, Rocío. Thanks for setting the scene and actually giving us the rationale behind the pilot idea. So it would be nice to actually hear more about the LEAP tool and what it means. And if you can also walk us through the tool step by step.
Yeah. So yes, this slide. There are 3 steps in the LEAP tool, which probably 2 of them you are familiar with, especially the first one. This is something that you can already find out there. This, you know, you go to a classic accelerator, they will talk about this. And the first step, it's relatively easy to do. You don't necessarily have to spend lots of money. You need to have the data, obviously, but this purely assesses the readiness, or the level of readiness of the company in market 1, right? And the way we did it, so obviously this exercise is easier said than done. You really need to have a framework that you need to make sure that you are covering every single aspect of the company. And that's where the LEAP, L-E-A-P comes from, which I'll explain later. But first step, relatively easy. You score yourself, you do a self-evaluation, you and your team, and you decide or not if you are ready to scale. Very simple. Step number 2, we find less common, and I think is a completely, for me, is a no-brainer. You really need to have in place your own red lines or non-negotiables, because otherwise, the moment you are out there, you may be tempted with AYZ, the latest flavor of the month. An investor comes and pushes you to sell something that is not of interest to you for whatever reason. So I think it's a really good exercise to sit down with your team and say, okay, as we are expanding, where do we want to focus and where do we don't want to go ever because of XYZ? Your non-negotiables or red lines, and these are the ways of calling that. Again, relatively easy to implement, but sometimes you realize that within the same company, you have like different, we could do everything. No, we don't do everything. We could expand it, but say, no. So I think this is a really good exercise. And the third step, which is the interesting part and probably where the novelty is how do you physically start in a new country? How do you go? Do you just hire lots of people and replicate what you have in country A already? Or what? And then it was clear to us that we were not going to do that because we don't know. I don't know anything about the Ugandan market, or I did not know anything about the Ugandan market. Therefore, we decided to almost like what we did in Kenya 6 years ago, to set up what we call lean experiments, a series of experiments which are relatively small and cheap to run, whereby you collect directly from the ground the information that matters to you and your business. So forget about the overall market research data. You are running these experiments in country, collecting real data from real customers that will let you know if there is market fit or not, if you have the right resources, if you have the right partners, and so on and so on. So maybe the way to, I think the best way to understand what the LEAP is all about, the LEAP tool is all about, I will take, so LEAP stands for, we kind of split the business in these 4 tags: leadership, enterprise, attraction, and provision. But for the sake of brevity and to make it a bit more interesting, I will concentrate on attraction, which is pretty much everything to do with your market and your clients. Are you serving your clients properly? Is the product that you are selling the right product? It's a very basic question, and you could really simplify it with the classic: do you have product market fit? So, and if not, why not? And how do you get to the holy grail of having product market fit? So I'll concentrate on attraction, and I'll give you one example for each of the steps. So in step number 1, which is going back to the definition, step number 1 is all about your current market. So do you know if you have current market fit in your current market, right? Do you understand well your customers? Do you understand how happy they are? Do you know what the NPS is? Do you know if you are serving early adopters or not? All those things which are to do with your current business model in your current market. Are you in the optimal level of serving your clients with the optimal range of goods that you are offering to them, and so on? So all of those you can say yes or no, and then it depends on you. If you feel that everything is a yes, and then you are really strong on your product market fit, it's a good sign for market number 2. If you don't really feel that market number 1 is under control, and you are still hesitating between your market sectors, and you don't know if you are serving youth or middle-aged women or low income or middle income, I personally wouldn't go to market 2 because my brain will explode. But that's my personal opinion. So then what do you do then? For example, step number 2, which when you are talking about, okay, hypothetically speaking, if we go to a second market and we expand internationally, what are we not going to compromise on? In my case, in the Bidhaa Sasa case, in terms of attraction, we are serving exclusively, specifically women in rural households. That's it. If an investor comes along and says, hey, there's a huge opportunity in urban youth, most likely we're going to say, sorry, there's no fit there, because our business is about serving women in rural households. And this is at the moment the way we are running the business. I may change my mind later on if I see that the serving the rural women is a disaster, but the evidence I have gathered from Kenya is strong enough to show that there is a strong potential to serve rural women also in Uganda. So that would be my non-negotiables in this particular case on the attraction side. And then the last one, which is the fun bit, the experiments. So what we did is we hired a project manager, which is in the audience, Brian, maybe you say hello. Maybe it was like almost 2 years ago. With all this COVID stuff, everything has been slow. And then with the project manager, we also hired a small team of salespeople. And what you do is just go there. You go out there and you start collecting data from your target customer. So one of the obvious steps is understanding your baseline. Even before you sell anything, or even before you want to offer something, you really need to understand which problems the people you are trying to serve do have right now, and how are they right now solving these problems. And it could be anything depending on your business model. For us, it's all about household goods, but other people could be in the, nutritional sector or the health sector. So obviously we restrict ourselves to problems related to quality of life, physical quality of life. And we have conversations about, tell me about how do you cook? How do you get water? What about the building you live in? What about the electricity that probably you don't have? What about your plot of land? What about your animals? So everything which is to do with the living environment of rural families. And then we run these surveys to have a feeling of where is the starting point? How can we help this particular market, in our case, rural women, with a range of products that will solve the problems that they already have and they acknowledge that they have. And one of the important things about these exercises is the ranking. Not all problems are the same, right? And this is a classic thing there. You have many things that you need to solve. You need to send your kids to school, and you need to run the business, and you need to run the farm. So how people rank these problems is very, very important when you design your MVP and you launch your first service or product out there. And I think I'll stop there. So that's an example of what we are still doing in Uganda in terms of using or developing this LEAP tool with specific experiments in Uganda run by a relatively small team, but with real physical clients, with real transactions and real products. And then, yeah, I think it's back to you, Yvonne, right?
Yes, indeed. But quite some interesting insights, and thank you for walking us through the LEAP tool and actually the steps that one needs to take when they go through the LEAP tool. So I think you've shared quite some interesting reflections. And I think one thing that I've gotten from the last slide that you're talking about, it is indeed quite important to have an adequate understanding of the current market and the landscape, especially when you talk about the target customer and making sure that you have the right product fit for that particular customer by understanding their problems, looking at the competitions in the various markets before you scale into a new market. And I think the key driver for this pilot, if we can just reflect on the pilot and why we selected it, was your desire to actually scale in Uganda. And like you mentioned, you actually worked with a small team, that were able to implement this particular pilot. And we would like to actually hear more about how this went in terms of the process, some of the challenges you faced, and what would be the results, or what were the results of some of your learnings, and any top tips that you might have to share with the other GDC members who are also looking to scale in a lean way. So back to you, Rocio.
Thanks. So some of the more interesting and tangible results that we have already gathered from operating in Uganda. The first thing is that with the COVID, the elections, and all these disasters one after the other, it really took us a while to start acquiring customers. So we only started physically selling, I think, in February this year, 2021. So the track record, the amount of data we have collected is not great, and obviously everything was delayed and all that. But still, with the data that we have collected so far, we have already learned a few things. And remember that the original idea of all this exercise is you believe you have a good business model that has worked in one country, and then you want to adapt it to the second country. So you are starting with a series of hypotheses that you think will work because it worked in Kenya. So it's all about this adaptation and, you know, how do you change the recipe, and it could be slightly changed or it could be massively changed. You don't know yet. So for example, what we have learned so far in Uganda compared with Kenya, in both cases, pretty much selling the same products to the same type of clientele, is on the similarities is that social networks in the rural areas, especially amongst the women, are very strong in both countries. I think from a social point of view, the social structures are very similar. You know, typical farmer will belong to 3 savings groups and a couple of co-ops and church groups and prayer groups and so forth. So I think, and this is one of the building blocks of our business model. So I think that is really important for us, because if that social networks are a bit weak, or people don't really trust each other, even though they live close by, we think our business model will not work. That's on the positives. On the negatives, what we have to struggle with is 2 things for now. On a practical side, is mobile money penetration in Uganda in rural areas is not as strong as in Kenya. Maybe from a top level statistical point of view, you see the numbers and you, oh, not too bad, penetration is high. But at the end of the day, is to do with the end user. And we have found that the end user is still a bit skeptical of mobile money as a concept. So that doesn't flow as easily as it does in Kenya. So I think we need to put more effort on convincing people to use mobile money, a lot of education and demystifying the use of mobile money. Obviously, we can't really tell MTN to simplify the menu, although we would like to. One day, you know, if we are super powerful, we could say to MTN, hey, MTN, your menu is ridiculous, please simplify it. But for now, we need to go on the sites and try to convince people that for this to work, mobile money is the future. So that's on the downside. It just requires more work for us. On the other side, that we have found as well, very few data points, or this could change, is on the gender side. Whereas in Kenya, we have a 70-30 split, 70% women, 30% men, more or less across all the products. In Uganda, is at the moment is like almost 50-50. And there is more biases towards certain products for certain genders, whereas in Kenya, you don't have that strong. So solar is a man thing and cook stoves is a women thing. In Kenya, it's not as strong as that. And because we are a women-focused company, obviously we need to probably do a little bit more work on how to address that, because our aim is to serve rural women. 50-50, you could say, okay, fair enough, that reflects society, 50-50. However, we want to do beyond that. We want to really address the women needs first, if we can. yeah, maybe next slide. So yeah, on top tips and stuff, recommendations. We love running experiments. This is what we do all the time. We did it when we started in Kenya. We still do it. We are still doing things in Kenya. We still are unsure about XYZ, so we run an A/B test. We gather data, we gather feedback from clients all the time, and so on. They are not that difficult to run them. They are not that expensive. But you really, one of the key things here is you really need to invest in your own resources, especially people, right? Human resources. So you really need to have the right people. And what I do not like is necessarily have independent teams doing different things. So you have your sales team here and your data team there, and they never talk to each other. I think that doesn't really work, because the data needs to flow from the ground, and it has to flow through the sales team, because the sales teams has the relationship with your clients. So they really need to work with each other. Your sales teams need to see the value on the data. And it's all about mentality, it's all about training, and for them embracing a data-driven culture. That's something that we are fighting on a daily basis. And I think we have made a lot of gains on that one, and people are relatively, they are happy, right? If you give them the right app and the right tools, they will go out there and they will do a little bit extra that is not strictly sales related, because it's in their own interest to understand your customer. It's all about understanding your customer. So invest on your resources, I think, is something that it may be a bit daunting at the beginning, but if you don't have the right infrastructure, you don't have the right people and the right mentality and the right tools, the physical tools to collect the data, it would be very hard to run any experiments, because you end up with reams of pieces of paper that nobody will ever read, and then you don't really gain anything from the exercise. Another tip that we were relatively fortunate with this is to get funding. If you can't find a donor which has a strong research inclination, and you present, hey, I'm going to do all these experiments with real transactions with real people, they love that stuff, because they are really hungry for proper data. They are also a bit tired of market research studies done by people based somewhere else. And if you tell them, hey, I'm going to work directly with the, how they call them, end users, or the beneficiaries from their point of view, they will listen to you. I promise that. So yeah, and that's a way of subsidizing your experiments, especially at the beginning. So that would be my kind of top tips, if you like it.
Thanks, Rocio. Charlotte, would you like to take us over from here?
Yeah, thanks, Yvonne. Really interesting. Thanks for those really tangible insights as well, Rocio. Hopefully we'll be able to pick up on some of those in a bit more detail in the Q&A now. Just before we open it up to questions though, you should see, just launching, there we go, a poll on your screen. We're really interested to know, if you are a GDC member, if you're a last mile distributor on the call, kind of how likely you are to engage with this tool to leverage some of the learnings for your own company's benefit. So please do let us know. And I haven't seen any questions come through in the chat, but I'm hoping that means that people want to jump in and ask their questions directly to Rocio. So just as that poll kind of finishes off, thank you very much. Please do feel free to unmute yourself now if you'd like to ask Rocio a question, whether it be related to kind of the practical use of the tool or more specifically about learnings from the Uganda pilot. I can see we've got a couple of GDC members on the call, so do feel free to unmute. If you don't have questions right now, that's fine. We've got a couple of questions that we'd like to pose to Rocio and Brian, who is also responsible for the pilot on the ground. So Yvonne, back to you, unless any of the GDC members want to jump in with a quick question.
Hi, I'm Max from System & Bio, and thanks a lot for this very interesting presentation. And I had a question for Rocio. So you mentioned this pilot duration, so where you do all the market analysis and you answer all of those questions you've listed. Before starting this stage, this pilot stage, what was the duration the duration of the pilot you were targeting, and what results would you say were really triggering the decision to scale up in this new area? Did you set like KPIs or very specific indicators to make the decision and to scale up? Thanks a lot.
Rocio, we can't hear you.
Sorry. Yes, thanks. I understand this question. This is a classic one, and it's a really hard one. When do you know that you have enough data to move on, right? When you launch your MVP, you collect data and you start iterating on your features. But when do you say stop? When do you think, okay, this is it, we made it? Which is the same thing as when do you stop running pilots and you start scaling up? Because at the moment we have only one small team. It's really difficult. And in Kenya, when we did this 6 or 7 years ago, we didn't really have a good set of indicators that gave us, okay, we did it. Now we put the accelerator and then we do it 10 times bigger. I think in Uganda, we are a bit more prepared, and we do have specific indicators that if you collect enough data, it gives you enough evidence that you are reaching the end result of these indicators. But having said that, we are selling on credit. Therefore, everything is extremely slow because it's not about selling, it's about getting repaid. And when you sell on credit, you really need to go through the whole cycle and the whole user experience, all the 12 months, whatever, loan payment plan that you have. So what we have done so far is like tiny in comparison to what we really want to have before we can say, okay, now we have it. We have adapted the business model from A to B. It will take, I reckon it should take at least a year, especially in our case, because we have the credit and the payment plans are anything between 6 months and 12 months, at the very least 1 year before you have the confidence to say, got it. I have my final product or my final first version of the product. I know who my partners are going to be. I know what resources I need to put in place. Maybe I go out and do a fundraise and then I put the accelerator. I think a year. We are definitely not there yet. Not yet. I think Brian may go like, what? But we are not yet there.
Thanks a lot.
Charlotte, I think I see a question in the chat. I think it's Eric Silverman. Would you mind just unmuting yourself and asking a question if that was a question you wanted to ask?
No, I was just saying hi.
Hi.
But thanks for the insights, Rocio, and thanks for putting this webinar together, guys.
Thanks, Eric. So as we wait for the other GDC members and other last mile distributors to pose another question for Rocio, I think, Maxence, you actually asked one of the questions that we were very keen to hear Rocio's reflection on. So I think one follow-up I have to that, Rocio, is how do you know that you have actually successfully accomplished to scale up? As you have said, it takes actually 1 year to know and be readily prepared to scale up. But when do you know you've actually been successful to scale up in a lean way?
Well, I don't know. So first of all, the definition of scaling, right? Scaling is not the same as growing.
Yeah.
So when your rate of growth in your sales is bigger than your rate of growth in your cost, you can say you are scaling. Before that, you are not scaling. You're just growing and adding more resources, but you are not really scaling. So I think the definition of scaling is quite clear. And when that happens, you know that you are scaling. In the meantime, the problem is the main thing is knowing when are you going to put all your resources to really turbocharge your market number 2. And that is where I'm hesitant, right? I'm not 100% confident I understand perfectly well my customer targets. What if they don't like my offering? What if they stop paying, and all these things? So turbocharging something when you are hesitant is stupid. It will be suicidal. So it's really when the question is how much data, how much evidence do you need to know that what you are doing is going in the right direction, and then you can do, okay, now I hire everybody that I need and I scale up properly. I think that's a really difficult. I think in Kenya it took us probably 4 years before we had the confidence to say, okay, we got it. Now we have the model. All we need to do now is cut and paste. The faster, the better. But in Uganda, we want to do this within 2 years, let's say. Maybe spend 1 year doing experiments and getting data, and another year preparing to scale, because you need to start building your infrastructure, right? These experiments, you don't need that much infrastructure. You don't need a head of marketing and a head of a CFO and a bookkeeper, blah, blah, blah. You just need the people on the ground collecting data and real transactions from real clients. But once you know what you're doing, you really need to invest in infrastructure. You really need to have your people in place with proper structures in place. Otherwise, the cut and paste will be a disaster. So I think at the very minimum, 2 years before you can say, okay, now turbocharge, and we want to be in these many regions in the country. I think that's my guesstimate.
Thanks, Rocio. Charlotte, do we have any other question in the chat before we ask one of our final questions on what we want to know?
No, I think if anyone's got questions, feel free to just unmute or tell the group to jump in. Otherwise, Yvonne, carry on.
Perfect. So I think one key question is, sometimes when scaling up, you find yourself looking for external funders or looking sometimes at donor funding. And I think when scaling up into new regions, like you mentioned, sometimes you might face challenges and you might need that 1 or 2 years to know that you'd successfully do it. So what would be your advice on this, especially for external funders, or even if it's grant funding, and when they want to see the results very soon, and for those who also want to see, for example, their return on investment?
Yeah, I think, this is an eternal question. So these experiments that we run in Uganda, and we still do it in Kenya, some people call them research. So what we have done in the past, and we're still doing, sometimes you do get some donor money that helps you to run specific experiments, because it lines up with their own mission, right? If they are dealing with farmers in Uganda, then there is some commonalities there. So I think the donors or the grants are ideal to run experiments, especially in the early stages. On the equity side and the debt side is very different. I heard equity investors saying, we don't fund pilots, right? We don't want pilots. We want established, we want proof of scalability, we want this and that. So nobody will give you money at the stage where we are in Uganda, because I could lie and say, yes, I know everything I'm going to do, and this is a business plan, but that's not true. I'm still figuring out my product offering. I'm still trying to understand, can people make repayments using mobile money? It's a very basic question, right? And so on the equity side, I think you need to have at least some track record to give investors the confidence that you know what you're doing, because they don't really like finding pilots. They don't, despite what they say, they are not going to be going there. And on the debt side, it's even worse, because the debt is all about ability of repaying your loan. And for that, you need track record. And as we are on the lending business, because we sell on credit, you need to have enough track record from your customers to prove that your customers pay well, so you can in turn pay them well. So it's a chicken and egg problem again. Unfortunately, without the track record, they are not going to lend you any money. So again, you need a certain number of transactions or a certain number of clients, or I don't know, every investor will be different, and they will have their own, risk tolerance. And maybe with some people will need 100,000 clients, and some people with 5,000 clients, they are happy. So, but that's on a case by case basis.
Thanks for your detailed response, Rocio. I think, Charlotte, those were the questions from my end, and I think they've been sufficiently answered. So I think it's time to return the session back to you.
Thank you. I just got one follow-up actually, Rocio, which is taking us back to a bit further back in the conversation. But you mentioned about the importance of all your teams working together so that data is flowing really freely through the sales team, etc. But in reality, how do you go about kind of embedding that data-driven culture in an organization if it's not necessarily there to start with, or if within your organization you typically work in a very siloed way, which I think is quite natural in some instances. So how did you go about that from a practical sense?
Yeah, I think there are several tricks. One of the things that work for us is quite simple, but it works, is to have your research team living next to your sales team physically, right? It just works. If they see each other, they start trusting each other. They know what each of people's jobs are. Oh, this is what you do on a daily basis. Oh, that's so interesting. Oh, this is what you do on a daily basis. Can I go with you and meet your clients? Yeah, of course. You know, it's not mythological. It's not that, oh, the guys in some office are doing all this data crunching. So I think that works. And then obviously the sales team are like, oh, another survey, and they roll their eyes and they go, oh no, again. But I think you need to give them value. If you ask people to do things for the sake of doing them, if they don't see the value themselves, you know, they are not going to do it, or they are going to do it badly or very reluctant. So, and it's really hard, especially with this a bit abstract things like, I don't know, collecting information from clients about, you know, problems that, I don't know, there is a little bit of a disconnect between the stories that these people are telling me and my day-to-day job, which is selling stuff to them. So everybody in the company that it touches data, which is practically everybody in the company, need to see the value of that data coming back to them. And it's harder, and we are not perfect on this. We are still struggling on how we derive value for each different user. If you are in the sales team, how this data matters to you. And if you are in the logistics team, how this data matters to you, and so on. It's not that easy. But I think once people see the value, they will embrace it. And it's natural, and it comes naturally, because they go, aha, that's why we are doing this. Now I understand where my clients are coming from when they haven't repaid. Maybe they haven't repaid because they are scared of the menu. They don't want to go, and they don't know what happens if they make a mistake. And will MTN take my money if I make a mistake and I send the money to another company? Very basic stuff that these surveys, they will dig. And then that helps the salesperson to go and say, don't worry, I'll help you. And we do the payment together. And then next time is easier for you. So I think that's is value. It's all about the value that people can derive from this data.
Thank you. And just on the first point about being like physically close, that must have been quite a challenge over the past year, obviously with the context. So how have you managed to kind of build those relationships online?
It's been really difficult.
So like, yeah, this is like the really question everyone wants to know the answer
to. Brian has been kind of isolated. I don't know for how many months. Nobody could go across the border. It was a disaster. So we had lots of periods, like lots of chunks of period where we couldn't physically do anything. And Brian was stuck at home, right? And the team cannot even go to meet clients. So it's been really, really, really difficult. But you can't really do this online. How are you going to do an in-depth interview with a potential client online? It just doesn't work. You need to sit down with them face to face. And in the good old times, although our business is very distributed because we are in many different branches, the branches don't necessarily know each other. We used to organize regularly team ups and meetings so people will know each other, even if it's like twice a year. at least you know who the rest of the company is. With the COVID, we stopped doing that, obviously, and it's the opposite. We maintained the teams isolated from each other just in case we were, expanding the disease across the team. So it was the opposite. We were like super strict on not meeting anybody else apart from the people in your team. And we have had teams that were down for 2 weeks with illness and suspected illness. Very, very difficult. And I don't have an answer for that. I don't see how on earth you could build a rapport with your colleagues or with your clients, most importantly, without physically meeting. I can't see it. I can't see it happening, especially in rural areas. So sorry for the e-commerce guys, but I can't really see how.
Thanks, Rocio. We've spoken a lot about Brian, so I just wanted to open it up in case Brian does want to add anything more to what Rocio has already said. Feel free to unmute yourself, Brian. If not, then we can wrap up.
Yeah, not really much to add. I think Rocio has shared most of what has happened. I thought if there are specific questions to activities in Uganda, be happy to answer. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Brian. And that's a really good point. So in follow-up to the call today, we'll be sharing the tool with you again. We'll share the recording. And you're also welcome to reach out to the GDC or the Bidhaa Sasa teams directly if you want to kind of dig a little bit deeper and find out some more information. So thank you so much, Rocio and Brian, for sharing the insights with us today. It's been really, really interesting. Hopefully those on the call have found it interesting and useful as well. Please do let us know, as always, how you found today's session, and any feedback that you'd like to share with the team directly is also always welcome. So yeah, once again, thank you for joining. Feel free to reach out and we will share the various materials with you in follow-up for you to dig into a little bit more deeply.
Thanks a lot. That was great.
Thanks, Max. Thanks for joining.